Story 1. Stephen Lindsay Moody was born on July 16, 1957, in Harris County, Texas. He was a white male. His family lived in the Houston area. His parents raised him there. Moody grew up like many other children in his neighborhood. He went to school. He made it through 10 years of education. He did not finish high school. He left school before getting his diploma. He never went to college. After leaving school, Moody needed to earn money. He found work as an oil field worker. That job kept him busy for some time. He worked with other men in the oil fields around Texas. He did physical labor. He earned a regular paycheck. But Moody did not stay out of trouble. His behavior started to show a pattern of breaking the law. He made bad choices. In 1978, when he was about 21 years old, Moody committed a burglary. He broke into a home with the intent to steal. This was a serious crime. He was caught and convicted. The court sentenced him to 8 years in prison. He went to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He stayed there for a few years. In January 1981, he was released on parole. That meant he could leave prison early, but he had to follow rules and not commit new crimes. Moody did not follow those rules for long. Later in 1981, he committed another crime. He stole a car. This was auto theft. He was caught again. He was convicted again. Because he broke his parole and committed a new felony, he was sent back to prison. This time, the court gave him a 6-year sentence for the car theft. He went back to prison in December 1981. He stayed there until November 1984. At that time, he was released on mandatory release. That meant he had served enough time and was let out, but he was still under supervision. After getting out in 1984, Moody again did not stay out of trouble for long. In 1985, he broke the law once more. This time, he committed burglary of a vehicle. He broke into a car to steal things from inside. He was caught and convicted. The court sentenced him to 14 years in prison. He went back to prison in April 1985. He served about 3.5 years of that sentence. In December 1988, he was released on parole again. At that time, Texas prisons were very crowded. A federal judge had ordered the state to release prisoners early to reduce overcrowding. So Moody was let out even though he had not served his full 14-year sentence. Moody was now a man with a long criminal record. He had been in and out of prison many times. He had convictions for burglary, auto theft, and more burglary. Each time he got out, he went back to his old ways. He did not have a stable life. He moved between jobs and trouble. He had relationships with friends and family, but he kept making bad decisions. He was known to people in his circle as someone who could be involved in illegal activities. In 1991, Moody was living in the Houston area. He was 34 years old. He was out of prison and trying to get by. He had connections to other people who were also involved in crime. He knew men like Calvin Doby, Lloyd Lario, and Melvin Ellis. They were part of his social world. Moody had habits that kept him around drugs and money. He knew people who sold drugs. He knew people who had cash. He was not working steadily. He was looking for ways to get money quickly, even if those ways were against the law. By this time, Moody had been in prison 3 separate times for felony crimes. Each time he was released, he went back to breaking the law. His past showed a clear pattern. He did not learn from his punishments. He kept committing crimes. He kept going back to prison. And in late 1991, he was out again, living in Harris County. He was still the same man who had always chosen crime over honest work. His life had not changed. He was still connected to people who committed robberies and sold drugs. He was still looking for easy money. He was still willing to break the law to get what he wanted. He was also still free, walking the streets of Houston, not knowing that his next bad decision would change everything. It is now October 1991. Stephen Moody is 34 years old and living in the Houston area. He is still associating with men who commit crimes. One of those men is Calvin Doby. Another is Lloyd Lario. Another is Melvin Ellis. These men knew each other from the streets. In late September 1991, about 3 weeks before the murder, a chain of events started. Calvin Doby, Lloyd Lario, and Melvin Ellis drove together from Houston to the nearby town of Dayton, Texas. During that car ride, Doby asked Lario a direct question. He asked Lario who supplied him with drugs. Lario was getting his drugs from a man named Joseph Hall. Lario told Doby Hall's name. He also told Doby where Hall lived. He told Doby that Hall kept his money in his pocket. He also told Doby that Hall drove a Chevrolet Camaro. That meant they could tell if Hall was home by looking for the Camaro in the driveway. Doby listened to all of this information. He was planning to rob Hall. Then came October 19th, 1991. That was the day of the crime. On that day, Doby, Lario, and Ellis drove together to Hall's house in Houston. They went there to look at the house. Lario pointed out the exact house to Doby. He also pointed out where Hall kept his money and drugs. They saw the Camaro in the driveway. That meant Hall was home. After they gathered this information, Doby made a phone call. He called Stephen Moody. He told Moody about the plan. He asked Moody to come and help with the robbery. About an hour and a half later, Moody and Doby met up at Ellis's house. From there, they went together to Hall's house. When Moody and Doby arrived at Hall's house, they did not knock and wait. They forced their way inside. They used physical force to enter. Once inside, they found Joseph Hall, who was 28 years old. Hall was disabled. He had been in an accident that left him crippled. He could walk, but he had physical limitations. Moody and Doby immediately demanded money and drugs from Hall. They shouted at him. They wanted him to give them everything valuable. Joseph Hall was afraid. He pleaded for his life. He said, "Please don't shoot me." He told them the money was in his pocket. He also said, "You're not the cops. Let me see your badges." He was trying to understand who these men were. But Moody did not show any badge. Moody was holding a sawed-off shotgun. This is a shotgun with a short barrel, easy to hide and very dangerous at close range. Meanwhile, Hall's girlfriend, Renee McKeege, was inside the house. She was in the bathroom at the time. She heard Hall yell out her name. Then she heard a man's voice screaming, "Where is the money?" She thought at first that the men might be police officers because there were drugs in the house. But then she heard Hall say they were not the cops. Then she heard scuffling sounds. Moody walked into the bathroom. He pointed the sawed-off shotgun directly at her. He said, "Stay there. Don't move." Renee stayed still because she was scared. Moody then left the bathroom and went back to Hall. He asked Hall again, "Where is the money?" Hall said the money was in his pocket and again begged, "Please don't shoot me." Moody came back to the bathroom a second time. He told Renee again, "Stay there, don't move." She answered, "Okay, I won't move." Moody shut the bathroom door and walked away. Renee did not stay in the bathroom. She acted quickly. She opened the bathroom window. She climbed out and jumped down. She ran through the backyard. She jumped over a fence. She ran to the house next door. The neighbor was Arthur Jesse Flores. While she was running across the yard, she heard a loud gunshot come from inside her house. It was the sound of the sawed-off shotgun firing. At that moment, Moody shot Joseph Hall at very close range. The shotgun blast hit Hall in the chest. Hall died from the wound. Renee made it to the neighbor's house. She called 911. She told the operator that someone had shot Hall. The police were dispatched to the scene. They arrived and found Hall dead on the living room floor. They also spoke to Renee. She told them what she had seen. She described the man with the shotgun. She said she saw his face. She could identify him later if she saw him again. However, the police did not have a name right away. They did not arrest anyone at that time. The case was open but unsolved. After the shooting, Moody and Doby did not stay at the house. They fled. They took $1,200 in cash from Hall. They left the house and drove away. About 45 minutes later, they arrived at Melvin Ellis's house. They went inside. They told Ellis what had happened. Dobie said, "Man, we had some trouble over there. We had to kill him." Moody then said, "Man, you know I had to do it." Ellis asked Moody if the man was dead. Moody answered, "Yeah, I shot him right in the heart." When Moody and Dobie left Ellis's house later, Ellis noticed something. He saw a shotgun in their vehicle. It was on the passenger side, where Moody had been sitting. Later, when Moody was asked about why he shot Hall, he gave a reason. He said that Hall started fighting. He said Hall would not listen to him. He said Hall would not lay down. He said he shot Hall because Hall kept trying to get up from the ground. That was Moody's explanation for the shooting. Weeks later, in December 1991, Moody committed another crime. He robbed a bank in Houston. He was caught for that bank robbery. He was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison for that crime. By the time the bank robbery case was finished, Moody was already in prison. But the murder of Joseph Hall still had not been solved. The police had not yet connected Moody to that killing. They had some information from Renee, but they did not know who the gunman was. The case remained open and unsolved for many months after the shooting. The murder of Joseph Hall had happened on October 19, 1991. For nearly a year, the case remained unsolved. The police had a description of the gunman from Renee McKeege, but they did not have a name. They did not know who had shot Hall. The investigation was stuck. Then, sometime in late 1992, a break came. A relative of Calvin Dobie contacted the police. This relative gave them a tip. The tip pointed to Dobie as being involved in Hall's murder. The police took this information seriously. They started looking at Dobie. From Dobie, they were able to connect the case to Stephen Moody. Moody was already in prison by that time. He had been serving his 40-year sentence for the bank robbery that he committed in December 1991. The police now had a suspect for the murder. The police prepared a photo lineup. This is a set of photographs of different men. They showed these photographs to Renee McKeege, who had witnessed the murder. Renee looked at the photos. She picked out Moody's picture without any doubt. She identified him as the man who had pointed the sawed-off shotgun at her in the bathroom. She also identified him as the man who had shot Hall. Her identification was strong and clear. Now the police had enough evidence. They formally charged Moody with capital murder. He was indicted on October 6, 1992. Since he was already in prison for the bank robbery, he was moved to the Harris County Jail to stand trial for the murder. Calvin Dobie was also charged. The trial for Moody began in early 1993. The trial took place before a jury. The prosecution presented their case. They called Renee McKeege to the witness stand. She testified about what she had seen and heard that night. She described how Moody pointed the shotgun at her and told her not to move. She described hearing Hall beg for his life and then hearing the gunshot. She identified Moody in the courtroom as the same man. The prosecution also called Melvin Ellis as a witness. Ellis testified about the conversation in the car weeks before the murder. He testified about going to Hall's house with Dobie and Lario to scout it out. He testified that after the murder, Moody and Dobie came to his house. He told the jury that Moody admitted to him, "I shot him right in the heart." Ellis also testified that he saw the shotgun in the vehicle after the shooting. During Ellis's testimony, something happened. Ellis said that Moody and Dobie left $100 of the stolen money at his house. Moody became angry. He spoke out loud in court. He called Ellis a liar and said Ellis had received $900, not $100. This outburst was heard by the jury and the judge. After hearing all the evidence, the jury considered the case. They found Moody guilty of capital murder. Capital murder means murder committed during another serious crime, like robbery. The jury then moved to the punishment phase. They heard about Moody's criminal past. They learned about his convictions for burglary and auto theft. They learned that he had been in and out of prison many times. On March 19, 1993, the jury answered the special questions required by Texas law in the affirmative. This meant they decided that Moody was a future danger and that there were no mitigating circumstances sufficient to spare his life. The judge sentenced Stephen Lindsay Moody to death by lethal injection. Moody's accomplice, Calvin Doby, also went to trial. He was convicted of capital murder as well, but his sentence was different. The jury in Doby's case sentenced him to life in prison. He was sent to prison and remained there. After his conviction and death sentence, Moody began the appeals process. This is a long legal process where a convicted person asks higher courts to review the case for errors. In January 1996, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed his conviction and death sentence. That meant the higher state court agreed with the trial court. Moody then filed for habeas corpus relief, which is a way to challenge the legality of his imprisonment. He raised several issues, including a claim that the prosecutor had improperly excluded a black juror from his trial. Moody is white, but he argued that the exclusion of the black juror violated his rights. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied this claim. Moody then took his case to federal court. He filed a petition in U.S. District Court. In September 2002, the federal district court agreed with Moody on the jury issue. They ruled that the trial court had made an error and granted Moody a new trial. However, the state of Texas appealed that ruling. The case went to the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. In January 2007, the Fifth Circuit reversed the lower court's decision. They ruled that even though the trial court had been wrong to deny Moody a hearing on the jury issue, the prosecutor had offered a valid race-neutral reason for striking the juror. So Moody was not entitled to a new trial. Moody then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. In October 2007, the Supreme Court declined to review his case. This meant all of his appeals were exhausted. His death sentence was final. While on death row, Moody had a personal change. He wrote about a religious experience. He said he felt peace and compassion. He said he read the Bible and found faith in Jesus Christ. He also made a decision. He said he was tired of living on death row. He called it cruel and unusual punishment. He asked his judge to set his execution date as soon as possible. He also told his lawyer not to file any more appeals to stop the execution. He said he was ready to die. As the execution date approached, Moody made another statement. He signed a sworn affidavit. In this statement, he said that Calvin Doby was innocent. He said Doby was not his accomplice on the night of the murder. He claimed that another man was with him. He said he wanted to clear Doby's name. This led to a new appeal being filed in Doby's case. But this did not stop Moody's execution. Prosecutors questioned Moody about his statement in the days before his death. The execution was set for September 16, 2009. On that day, at the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas, Stephen Lindsay Moody was strapped to a gurney. The lethal injection drugs were ready. The victim's family was watching through a window. Moody gave his final words. He addressed Joseph Hall's mother and son. He said, "I was unable to respond to you in the courtroom. I can only ask that you have the peace that I do." He then spoke to his own family and friends. He told his brother he loved him. He said to the warden, "Warden, pull the trigger." The execution team began the lethal injection at 6:20 p.m. The drugs flowed into his arms. He was pronounced dead at 6:28 p.m. After the execution, Joseph Hall's son, who was also named Joseph Hall, issued a statement. He disagreed with the claim that his father was a drug dealer. He said that drugs had nothing to do with the death. He wrote that his father was robbed of money he had received from an accident that left him crippled. He said that justice was served. Calvin Doby remained in prison, still serving his life sentence, with a new appeal pending based on Moody's last-minute statement. The case of Stephen Lindsay Moody was over. He had started as a man with a long criminal record, committed a brutal robbery and murder, evaded capture for nearly a year, was convicted and sentenced to death, exhausted all appeals, and was executed by lethal injection, leaving behind a victim's family that had waited 18 years for finality. Story 2. Christopher Bernard Coleman was born on December 28, 1971, in Houston, Texas. Houston is a very large city in Harris County, which is in the southeastern part of the state. Christopher was born into a working-class family. This meant his parents and relatives did not have a lot of extra money. They worked regular jobs to pay for housing, food, and other basic needs. Christopher grew up in this environment, surrounded by other families who also worked hard to get by. When Christopher was a young child, he went to school like most children in his neighborhood. He attended public schools in the Houston area. The public schools were where children from his community went to learn reading, writing, and math. Christopher went to school for 11 years in total. That means he went through most of high school, but he did not finish the final year. He never received a high school diploma. He stopped going to classes before he could graduate. This was a turning point in his life because without a diploma, it was harder for him to find good jobs later on. After he left school, Christopher had to find ways to earn money. He did not have special training or a college degree. He worked as a laborer. A laborer is a person who does physical work with their hands. He might have done jobs like carrying heavy items, cleaning, or helping on construction sites. He did not have a steady career. He moved from one job to another. He never earned a lot of money from these jobs. He lived a simple life without many luxuries. When Christopher became a young adult, he made a decision to join the United States Army. The Army is a branch of the military that trains people to defend the country. He went through basic training. In the Army, he learned how to follow orders from his commanders. He also learned how to handle firearms. The Army taught him discipline and how to stay calm in stressful situations. He spent some time serving in the military. However, he did not make the Army his lifelong career. At some point, he left the service and returned to Houston, Texas. He went back to the city where he was born and where his family lived. Once he was back in Houston, Christopher returned to his old way of life. He did not have a good education, and he did not have a special skill that employers were looking for. So he went back to working as a laborer. He took whatever jobs he could find. He did not make much money. He lived from paycheck to paycheck. He did not own a house or have a lot of savings. He was an ordinary man trying to get by in a big city. Christopher was a black male. He was not very tall. He stood 5 feet and 7 inches tall. He weighed about 185 pounds. He had black hair and brown eyes. He looked like many other young men in Houston. There was nothing about his appearance that made him stand out in a crowd. During this time in his life, Christopher had one encounter with the law that is part of his record. He was arrested one time for assault. Assault means that a person hurts another person or threatens to hurt them. He was found guilty of this charge. The court gave him a punishment of 60 days in the Harris County Jail. This was not a very long sentence. He served those 60 days and was released. After that, he did not have any other prison sentences. He had no prior prison record before the events that came much later in his life. Christopher did not have a lot of close friends or a strong social circle. He kept to himself mostly. He did not have a wife or children that are mentioned in the records. He lived a quiet and somewhat lonely life. He did not have many possessions. He did not have a lot of ambitions or plans for the future. He just went day by day, doing his work and staying out of trouble after that one arrest. His life up to this point was not unusual for a young man from a working-class background in Houston. He had made some mistakes, like leaving school early and getting arrested once. But he had also tried to do something positive by joining the Army. He had returned to civilian life and was trying to survive on low-paying jobs. He did not have any big dreams. He did not have any plans to do anything extreme or dangerous. He was just a regular person living in his hometown, working, and getting by from one day to the next. That was how Christopher Bernard Coleman lived his life for many years. He stayed in Houston. He kept working. He kept his head down. He did not cause any major problems after that one jail sentence. He was known to some people in his neighborhood, but he was not famous or well known. He was just another face in the crowd. His life seemed ordinary and unremarkable. In December 1995, Christopher Coleman was still living in Houston and working as a laborer. He did not have much money. Around this time, he became involved with two other men. Their names were Enrique Mosquera and Derek Graham. These three men would soon take part in a violent event that changed many lives forever. The trouble started with a drug debt. Enrique Mosquera owed a large amount of money to a man named Jaimar Prado Hurtado. The debt was for 4 kilograms of cocaine. Cocaine is an illegal drug. Mosquera had received the cocaine from Hurtado, but he did not want to pay for it. The total amount he owed was $80,000. That was a very large sum of money. Mosquera did not have that much cash, and he did not want to give up what little he had. So Mosquera came up with a plan to get out of paying the debt. He decided to stage a fake robbery. The idea was to arrange a meeting with Hurtado, as if he was going to pay the money. But instead of paying, Mosquera would have other men pretend to rob the meeting. That way, Mosquera could say he was a victim, and he would not have to pay the debt. He would also keep the cocaine or avoid the consequences of not paying. To carry out this plan, Mosquera needed help. He hired Christopher Coleman and Derek Graham to be the ones who would carry out the fake robbery. Mosquera agreed to pay Coleman $12,000 for his part in the plan. He agreed to pay Graham $10,000. Both men accepted the offer. They were willing to take part in this scheme for the money. The plan was set in motion on the night of December 13th, 1995. Mosquera, Coleman, and Graham got into a car together. They drove around Houston that night. They were waiting for the right time to meet with the people who were owed the drug money. They knew that Hurtado would be coming with other people. The meeting was arranged for the early morning hours of December 14th, 1995. The location was a dead-end street in a residential neighborhood in Houston. A dead-end street means the road does not go through to another street. It stops at the end. This was a good place for the plan because there would be less traffic and fewer people around to see what happened. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Coleman and his two companions drove to that dead-end street. They stopped their car and waited. Soon after, another car arrived and parked behind them. That second car was a Toyota Paseo. It had 4 people inside. The driver of that car was a man named Jose Luis Garcia Castro. He was 33 years old. In the front passenger seat was Jaimar Prado Hurtado. He was 34 years old. He was the man to whom Mosquera owed the $80,000 for the cocaine. In the back seat were 2 other people. One was Elsie Prado. She was Hurtado's sister, and she was also Garcia Castro's girlfriend. Next to her was her 3-year-old son, Danny Giraldo. The little boy was sleeping in the back seat at that time. The 4 people in that car believed they were coming to collect the money that Mosquera owed them. They did not know that a fake robbery was planned. They did not know that they were walking into a trap. After the second car stopped, Coleman, Mosquera, and Graham got out of their own car. All 3 men walked toward the other vehicle. They approached the passenger side of the car where the victims were sitting. One of the 3 men spoke to the people inside the car. He talked to Hurtado in the front seat. It seemed like a normal conversation at first, but that was not the real plan. While one of the men was speaking, Christopher Coleman moved very close to the passenger side of the car. He was standing right next to the car door. Then he pulled out a handgun. A handgun is a small firearm that can be held in one hand. He pointed the gun at the people inside the car. Coleman then opened fire. He shot the gun many times into the car. He fired 11 shots in total. The bullets hit the people inside the small vehicle. There was nowhere for them to go. They were trapped inside the car. The gunfire struck Jose Luis Garcia Castro, the driver. He was hit and died at the scene. The bullets also struck Jaimar Prado Hurtado. He was the man who was owed the drug money. He also died at the scene. The bullets struck little Danny Giraldo, the 3-year-old boy who was sleeping in the back seat. He was killed as well. 3 people lost their lives in that car. Elsie Prado was also shot. She was hit several times by the bullets. She was seriously injured, but she did not die. She survived the attack. During the shooting, she was able to see the face of the man who was firing the gun. She got a very clear look at him. She later said she would never forget his face. She saw him standing close to the passenger side, shooting into the car where she and her family were sitting. After the shooting stopped, Coleman and the other 2 men got back into their own car. They drove away from the dead-end street. They left the scene behind them. The victims were left in the car on that quiet residential street. 3 of them were dead. 1 was wounded but alive. Later that morning, the police arrived at the scene. They found the car with the 3 dead bodies inside. They also found Elsie Prado, who was still alive but badly hurt. She was taken to a hospital for treatment. The police began to investigate what had happened. They talked to people in the neighborhood. They tried to find out who had done this terrible thing. 9 days after the shooting, the police showed Elsie Prado a set of photographs. This is called a photo spread. They asked her to look at the pictures and see if she could identify the shooter. She looked at the photos. She pointed to one picture and said that was the man who had fired the gun into the car. The picture she picked was of Christopher Coleman. She was very sure about her identification. She said she would never forget his face. At the time, the police did not immediately arrest Coleman. They gathered more information. They learned that Enrique Mosquera had planned the fake robbery to avoid paying his drug debt. They learned that Coleman and Graham had been hired to help. The police started to build a case against all 3 men. Enrique Mosquera was later tried for capital murder. The jury could not agree on giving him the death penalty, so he received a life sentence in prison. Derek Graham also received a life sentence for his part in the plot. But Coleman's case would take a different path. The shooting left 3 people dead. 1 woman survived. A 3-year-old boy lost his life that night. He had no part in the drug deal. He was just a child who was sleeping in the back seat of his mother's car. The other 2 men were involved in the drug trade, but they did not expect to be killed that night. They came to collect a debt, and instead they were shot down in the street. The plan that Mosquera made to avoid paying money ended with bloodshed. Coleman had taken part in the shooting. He had been paid $12,000 to be there and to use his gun. He fired the shots that killed 3 people and wounded a 4th. His actions were direct and violent. The evidence from the scene showed that the shots came from the passenger side of the car. That matched where Elsie Prado said she saw the shooter standing. The police had a clear witness. They had a photo identification. They had the testimony of the survivor. They also had the story of the fake robbery that had been planned. All of these pieces pointed to Christopher Coleman as the man who pulled the trigger. But for now, the investigation was still in its early stages. The police had not yet fully closed the case. They had leads and they had a suspect. The next steps would involve catching him and bringing him to justice. After the shooting on December 14, 1995, the Houston police continued their investigation. They had a witness, Elsie Prado, who had identified Christopher Coleman from a photo spread 9 days after the crime. The police now had a clear suspect. Their next step was to find Coleman and bring him in for questioning. On December 29, 1995, the Houston police received important information. They learned that Christopher Coleman had been taken into custody in Lawrenceburg, Tennessee. Lawrenceburg is a small city in the state of Tennessee, which is far from Houston. Coleman was being held there by local authorities for some other reason. The Houston police officers who were investigating the murders quickly made plans to go to Tennessee. 2 Houston police officers flew to Tennessee that same night. They arrived at the Lawrenceburg police station. Their goal was to interview Coleman about the murders in Houston. They wanted to hear what he had to say about the events of December 14th. When the officers met Coleman at the station, they followed the proper legal procedures. They read him his Miranda rights. These are warnings that police must give to a suspect before questioning. The warnings tell the suspect that they have the right to remain silent and that anything they say can be used against them in court. They also tell the suspect they have the right to have a lawyer present. After the officers read these rights to Coleman, he agreed to waive them. This meant he chose to talk to the police without a lawyer present. The officers then questioned Coleman for about 3 hours. During this interview, Coleman gave a statement. He admitted that he had been at the scene of the crime on the night of the shooting. He said he was present when the murders happened. However, he did not admit to being the person who fired the gun. He said he was there, but he denied being the shooter. The officers recorded his statement. They had his admission that he was at the location when the shootings took place. After the interview, the officers transported Coleman back to Texas. He was arrested and charged with capital murder. Capital murder is a very serious charge that can carry the death penalty. Coleman was held in custody while the case moved forward. In October 1996, a grand jury in Harris County indicted Christopher Coleman for capital murder. An indictment is a formal charge that says the person is accused of a crime. The case was then set for trial. The trial took place in June 1997. The prosecution presented its case against Coleman. The key witness for the prosecution was Elsie Prado. She was the survivor of the shooting. She testified in court about what she had seen that night. She told the jury that she had seen Coleman firing the gun into the car. She said she got a good look at his face, and she was certain he was the shooter. She also told the jury about the photo spread, where she had identified him 9 days after the crime. The prosecution also presented other evidence. They showed that Coleman had admitted to being at the scene. They presented information about the plan to stage a fake robbery. They showed that Coleman had been paid $12,000 to take part in the scheme. The state argued that even if Coleman was not the only person involved, he was the one who fired the shots that killed 3 people. The defense attorneys argued that Coleman was not the gunman. They said that the evidence did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he had fired the shots. They tried to raise questions about the identification by Elsie Prado, but the jury listened to all the evidence. On June 3, 1997, the jury found Christopher Coleman guilty of capital murder. The trial then moved to the punishment phase. The jury had to decide whether Coleman should receive the death penalty or life in prison. They considered the evidence presented by both sides. The prosecution argued that Coleman was a continuing threat to society. The defense argued for a lesser sentence. After deliberating, the jury made their decision. On June 6, 1997, the jury sentenced Christopher Coleman to death. This was the legal punishment for his crime under Texas law. The judge formally accepted the jury's decision and ordered that Coleman be sent to death row. After the trial, Coleman began the appeals process. In Texas, every death sentence is automatically appealed. Coleman's lawyers filed appeals in state and federal courts. They argued that there were errors in his trial. They raised many issues, including claims about the identification process and claims about the jury instructions. But the courts reviewed these claims and rejected them. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed Coleman's conviction and sentence in May 1999. This means the higher court agreed that the trial was fair and the sentence was correct. Coleman then filed a state habeas corpus application. Habeas corpus is a legal action that allows a prisoner to ask a court to review whether their imprisonment is lawful. That application was denied in April 2001. He filed more applications, but they were all dismissed. Coleman also filed a federal habeas petition in a United States District Court. The federal court denied his request for relief in September 2004. He then appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. That court also denied his appeal in July 2006. He petitioned the United States Supreme Court to review his case, but the Supreme Court denied his petition in April 2007. This meant that all of his legal appeals had been exhausted. In May 2009, the trial court set an execution date for Coleman. He was scheduled to be executed on September 22, 2009. As the date approached, Coleman's lawyers made one more attempt to stop the execution. They presented new evidence that raised questions about Elsie Prado's testimony. They argued that Prado had known Enrique Mosquera from their time in Colombia. They said that she might have had a reason to protect Mosquera and falsely identify Coleman as the shooter. They asked the courts to stop the execution and review this new information. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals reviewed this new claim. They ruled that even without Prado's testimony, Coleman could have been found guilty under Texas law. Under Texas law, a person can be convicted of capital murder if they take part in a murder, even if they did not personally fire the fatal shots. The appeals court rejected Coleman's request. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles also denied a request for clemency. Clemency is an act of mercy that could have reduced his sentence or delayed the execution, but the board did not grant it. On September 22, 2009, the day of the execution arrived. Coleman was at the Huntsville unit, which is the state prison in Huntsville, Texas. This is where executions are carried out. The time for the execution was set for after 6 p.m. that day. At 6:14 p.m., Coleman was asked if he had any final words. He spoke briefly. He said, "Yes. Ain't no way FOFO. I love all y'all." These were his only words. The meaning of FOFO was not clearly explained. Some people thought it referred to a type of gun or car rims, but no one knew for sure what he meant. The execution then began. The lethal injection was administered. This is a series of drugs that stops the heart and causes death. Coleman was pronounced dead at 6:22 p.m. that evening. He was 37 years old. He was the 18th person executed in Texas in 2009. After the execution, the case was fully closed. Christopher Coleman was buried or laid to rest by his family. No personal witnesses attended his execution. Neither his family nor the victims' families chose to be present in the viewing room. The two other men involved in the crime received their punishments. Enrique Mosquera and Derek Graham were both convicted of capital murder for their roles in the plot. Both were sentenced to life in prison. They did not receive the death penalty. The survivor, Elsie Prado, had to live with the memory of that night. She had lost her brother, her boyfriend, and her young son in a single violent act. She had survived being shot multiple times. She had testified in court and helped bring the shooter to justice. Her life was forever changed by what happened on that dead-end street in Houston. The victims were buried by their families. Jose Luis Garcia Castro was 33 years old when he died. Jaimar Prado Hurtado was 34. 3-year-old Danny Giraldo was just a child. Their lives ended suddenly and violently. They were the victims of a plan that was meant to avoid paying a drug debt. They went to a meeting expecting to collect money, but they never returned home. Christopher Coleman was executed for his crimes. The state of Texas carried out the death sentence that the jury had imposed. The legal process had taken more than 12 years from the crime to the execution. All of the appeals had been heard and rejected. The courts had confirmed that his trial was fair and his punishment was appropriate under the law. The case was now over. The final outcome was clear. 3 people were dead because of the shooting. 1 person survived. 3 men were convicted. 1 of those men was executed. The other 2 received life sentences. The justice system had completed its work. The story of Christopher Coleman and the victims on that dead-end street had reached its final conclusion. Story 3. Max Landon Payne was born on November 10th, 1970, in the state of Alabama. He was the youngest of 5 children in his family. His parents were not married for very long. His biological father, whose name was Patrick, was an alcoholic. Patrick was also physically violent towards Max's mother. Because of this, the marriage did not last. Patrick left the family before Max was even 1 year old. After that, Max did not see his father very much. He only saw his father a handful of times before he reached the age of 12. After Patrick left, Max's mother married another man. This man's name was Purvis Mims. Mims was also an alcoholic, and he was a violent man as well. He would physically abuse Max's mother in front of the children. He also physically abused Max and his siblings. This abuse happened often, about once or twice every month, starting from when Max was around 7 years old until he left home. Mims would hit Max in the face, in the stomach, or anywhere he could reach. Max also witnessed something even more disturbing. He saw his stepfather molest his older sister Evelyn on several occasions. This was very upsetting for Max. Growing up, Max was not a healthy child. He had frequent and severe stomach pain. He had trouble eating, and he was often sick. When he was 11 years old, he had to have surgery on his intestines to correct a medical problem. Because of his health issues, he was small for his age. He was often bullied and teased by other children. They would push him down, tear his clothes, and leave him with bruises and scrapes. He got into fights frequently, usually because other boys would pick on him. However, sometimes he would start fights himself to defend other children who were being picked on, such as a mentally retarded boy in the neighborhood. His mother described him as the whipping boy in the neighborhood. Max began drinking alcohol at a very early age. His sister remembered seeing him drink when he was only 7 or 8 years old. His stepfather, Mims, would often supply him with alcohol. Max also started drinking heavily by the time he was around 15 years old. He would drink a case of beer every day for many years. He also used street drugs. Because of the abuse at home, Max left his mother's house when he was around 12 or 13 years old. He could not take the beatings anymore. He was passed around to live with different relatives. For a time, he went to live with his biological father in Texas. He came back to Alabama for a while, then returned to Texas again. He never completed the 8th grade. He had several jobs as he got older, but he never held any of them for a very long period of time. Despite his troubled childhood, Max was very close to his sisters, especially his sister Wilma. He was protective of her. When they were children, if Wilma got into trouble with their mother, Max would tell his mother that he was the one who did it, so that his mother would whip him instead of Wilma. He also helped Wilma when she had miscarriages and when she needed money for her daughter's doctor bills. In the 4 years before his arrest, his oldest sister Alma spent a lot of time with him. Alma described Max as the best friend she ever had. He was good with her son, building the boy a treehouse and encouraging him to stay in school. As an adult, Max continued to struggle with personal problems. He had ongoing issues with his nerves and anxiety. He went to a doctor to get medicine to help calm him down. He also had a girlfriend or wife, and he became very upset around the time he learned that a child he thought was his might actually not be his. This news caused him a great deal of emotional stress. His drinking became even worse around this time. He also had a car accident about a week before the events that would later change his life. In that accident, he sprained his shoulder and had to wear a sling to protect it. Max had never received any professional counseling or treatment for all the terrible things he experienced as a child. He never got help for witnessing the abuse of his mother, the molestation of his sister, or the physical beatings he endured himself. He never received any formal treatment for his long history of alcohol and substance abuse. His life was marked by a pattern of instability, poor health, family dysfunction, and heavy drinking. He moved from place to place, never finding a stable situation. On the day that would later become the focus of his trial, Max was living at his sister Wilma's house. He spent the early part of that day with his girlfriend and others. He had been drinking heavily over the previous several hours. His family members later noticed that he seemed to be acting strangely and not like himself. But at that time, no one knew what was about to happen. On the evening of March 23, 1992, Max Payne was at his sister Wilma Easterling's house. His girlfriend, Sandra Walker, was also there. At around 6 p.m., Payne left the house with 3 other people. He returned about 10 minutes later. When he came back, he went to a closet and took out a double-barreled shotgun. Wilma asked him why he needed the shotgun. Payne replied that he was taking it in case somebody fucks with me. Then he left the house again with the shotgun. At approximately 8:25 or 8:30 p.m., 2 customers saw Payne inside the West Point grocery store. The store was owned by a 58-year-old man named Braxton Brown. Payne was inside the store, and he had the shotgun with him. A short time later, at about 8:33 p.m., an employee who monitored the store's alarm system received a signal that a hold-up alarm had been triggered at West Point Grocery. That employee immediately called the sheriff's department. A deputy sheriff responded to the call and arrived at the store at 8:48 p.m. When he got there, he found the store's door open. Some of the lights inside the store were turned off, and the outside lights were also off. The deputy looked inside and saw several packs of Marlboro cigarettes scattered on the floor in front of the counter. He found no one inside the store. He secured the area and called for backup. What had happened was this: Payne had robbed the store. He had taken money and other items. He also kidnapped Braxton Brown, forcing him to leave the store at gunpoint. Payne then drove Brown in his blue Ford Maverick car to his sister Wilma's house. When they arrived at the house, Wilma and Sandra Walker were still there. Payne had a handgun in his right hand, which he kept hidden inside the sling on his left arm. He stood very close to Brown. Sandra Walker later testified that Brown appeared extremely nervous and scared. Payne ordered Brown to give Wilma some money. Brown took out 4 $5 bills, which totaled $20, and laid them on the kitchen table. Wilma told Brown that she did not want the money. Sandra Walker heard Wilma begging Payne, saying "don't do this" several times. Wilma then asked Payne to leave Brown with her, or to take him back to his store. She suggested that if he took Brown back, maybe he would forget about this. Brown nodded his head nervously, showing that he agreed with Wilma's suggestion. But Payne rejected this idea. He said, "No, I am going to do this." Then he forced Brown to leave the house with him. This was the last time that Braxton Brown was seen alive by anyone who knew him. As Payne and Brown were leaving Wilma's house, they passed by a man named Ricky Smith and his wife, who were just arriving. Ricky Smith saw them leaving. When Smith walked into Wilma's house, she was crying. He overheard her tell his wife that Payne had robbed and kidnapped Brown. At approximately 9:15 p.m., Payne arrived at another man's house, a man named George Cleghorn. Payne asked Cleghorn if he could use the telephone. He made a phone call to someone and asked that person if they had any bullets for a .22 rifle. He also asked Cleghorn if he had any bullets. Cleghorn did not have any bullets to give him. Around this same time, Payne's other sister, Alma, went to the West Point grocery store. She spoke to a police sergeant who was at the scene. She told the sergeant that her brother, Max Payne, was traveling in a blue Ford Maverick car that had one missing headlight. She also told the police that her brother was in the company of Braxton Brown. Based on this information, the police issued an all-points bulletin to look for the car and to be aware that Payne was with Brown. At 10 p.m., an investigator was at the West Point grocery store taking photographs of the scene. He received a call that gunshots had been heard in the area. He went to try and find where the shots came from, but he could not locate the source. He returned to the store. Then he received another call that Brown had been seen with Payne. He also received information that Brown and Payne had been seen together at a residence near a place called Bethel. The investigator left the store and went to that residence. Another investigator arrived at Wilma Easterling's residence at approximately 10:15 p.m. He located a blue Ford Maverick car parked outside the house. This was the same car that Payne had been driving that evening. The investigator looked inside the car through the windows, which were down. He observed several beer cans inside. He also saw some shotgun shells that had already been fired, as well as several shotgun shells that had not been fired. He also saw a blue arm sling in the back seat of the car. The keys were still in the ignition. The investigator called for backup, and other officers arrived. They opened the trunk of the car, looking for the victim, but he was not there. The sheriff removed the keys from the ignition. Later, the car was towed to the sheriff's department for a more thorough search. At 12:05 a.m. on March 24, 1992, Payne went to a Greyhound bus station in Birmingham, Alabama. He bought a bus ticket to Key West, Florida. He gave a fake name to the ticket agent, calling himself James Beavers. The ticket agent later noticed that Payne was wearing a white t-shirt and torn blue jeans. She also noticed that the jeans had blood stains on them, and that Payne had cuts on his face. When he bought his ticket, he gave the ticket agent a gold chain. He also had a blue money bag tied to his waist that contained a lot of money. He told the ticket agent that he got the money from selling his car. While waiting for his bus, Payne handed out cigarettes to other passengers and even helped one person pay for a bus ticket. On the morning of March 24, 1992, a volunteer fireman who lived near West Point went to search for Braxton Brown. He went to a bridge that crossed over a body of water called Crooked Creek. On the bridge, he noticed a dark red substance on the bridge surface and on the railing. He also discovered a partial dental plate on the bridge. He immediately contacted the sheriff's department. Sheriff's investigators arrived at the bridge. They observed the red stains on the bridge and the partial dental plate. They also found a broken pair of eyeglasses and a lens on the bridge. One of the investigators discovered a body in the creek below. When the body was brought up from the water, the investigators saw that most of the victim's face was missing. There were 2 large holes in the face, one in the forehead and one in the mouth. The coroner, who was present, knew Braxton Brown and identified the body as his. Investigators believed the holes were caused by a shotgun blast. The victim's body was taken for an autopsy. The autopsy later revealed that the victim had been shot twice in the face with a shotgun from a distance of only 1 to 1.5 feet away. The medical examiner removed 466 shotgun pellets from the victim's skull. The cause of death was the gunshot wounds to the head. Also on the morning of March 24th, an investigator went to Payne's mother's house. Payne's sister Alma was there. She gave the investigator a double-barreled shotgun that she had in the trunk of her car. This shotgun was later identified as the same shotgun that Payne had taken from the closet earlier that evening. Also on that same morning, a man walked into the Greyhound bus station in Birmingham with a wallet that he had found about a block away. The ticket agent who had sold Payne his ticket was still working. She called the Birmingham police. When she looked inside the wallet, she found Braxton Brown's Social Security card and 9 different credit cards, all with Brown's name on them. By this time, Payne was already on a bus traveling to Florida. He had fled the state. The police in Alabama notified authorities in Miami, Florida, that Payne was expected to arrive there. On March 25, 1992, 2 days after the murder, a detective from the Metro-Dade Police Department in Miami, Florida, received a telephone call from Alabama authorities. They told him that Max Payne was expected to arrive at the Greyhound bus station in Miami that day. The Alabama authorities gave the detective a description of Payne. They told him that Payne was involved in a robbery and murder in Cullman, Alabama. They also told him that Payne would be carrying a green duffel bag, that he was probably armed, and that he was likely traveling under the fake name James Beavers. Based on this information, the Miami detective went to the Greyhound bus station and waited for Payne's bus to arrive. When the bus pulled in, a security guard held everyone on the bus, so the detective could identify the people as they got off. The detective approached Payne after he exited the bus. Payne was carrying a green duffel bag. When the detective asked for his name, Payne identified himself as James Beavers. The detective was about to pat Payne down for weapons, but Payne volunteered that he had a .25 caliber gun in his right rear pocket. The detective removed the gun from Payne's pocket. This gun was later identified as having belonged to Braxton Brown. The detective also removed Payne's wallet. Inside the wallet, the identification card had the name Max Landon Payne, not James Beavers. Payne was then transported to the Miami Police Homicide Division. At the station, the detective asked Payne if he could search the green duffel bag. Payne signed a form giving his consent for the search. When the detective opened the bag, he found many items. These items included a jeweler's invoice that was made out to West Point Grocery, a Greyhound bus ticket in the name of James Beavers, a vehicle registration in Braxton Brown's name, 3 cartons of Marlboro cigarettes, 3 bank deposit bags that contained numerous checks written to West Point Grocery, credit card receipts, rings, and food stamps, bank receipts in Braxton Brown's name, $196.54 found in Payne's wallet, and $889.30 found inside the bank bags. In total, Payne had $1,085.84 on him. Brown's son later identified many of these items as belonging to his father's store. Forensic testing was also conducted. Scientists tested a tissue sample that had been found on Payne's arm sling. They compared it to Braxton Brown's blood type. The test results showed that the tissue on the arm sling could have come from Brown. Further DNA testing was done on the tissue from the sling and on Brown's blood. The results showed that the tissue from the sling and the blood from Brown were the same type. This type appears in only about 6% of the population. The test concluded that there was a 94% chance that the tissue from Payne's sling was actually Braxton Brown's tissue. The scientists also concluded that the tissue could not have come from Payne himself. Payne was arrested in Miami and brought back to Alabama to face charges. On April 16, 1992, a grand jury in Cullman County indicted him on 3 counts of capital murder. All 3 counts related to the death of Braxton Brown. Count 1 charged that Payne intentionally murdered Brown during an abduction with the intent to commit robbery. Count 2 charged that Payne intentionally murdered Brown during an abduction with the intent to inflict serious physical injury. Count 3 charged that Payne intentionally murdered Brown during a robbery in the first degree. Payne's trial did not begin until May 23, 1994. This was more than 2 years after the crime. The delay happened for several reasons. Payne filed many motions before the trial, including motions for psychiatric evaluations, motions to change the trial location, and motions to suppress evidence. The trial court also went through several judges. 1 judge retired, and 2 other judges had to recuse themselves for various reasons. The Alabama Supreme Court eventually appointed a judge from another county to hear the case. During the trial, the prosecution presented 30 witnesses. These witnesses included the customers who saw Payne at the store, Payne's girlfriend Sandra Walker, the police officers who responded to the scene, the investigators who found the body, the ticket agent who sold Payne the bus ticket, the Miami detective who arrested him, and the forensic scientists who tested the evidence. The prosecution presented a very strong case linking Payne to the robbery, kidnapping, and murder of Braxton Brown. Payne's defense team presented 11 witnesses. Their main strategy was to suggest that another man, a man named James Beavers, could have committed the murder instead. Several witnesses testified that they saw a man with shoulder-length blonde hair in the area at the time of the crimes. James Beavers himself testified that he did not know anything about the crime. The defense also presented Payne's family members who testified about his difficult childhood, his alcohol and drug abuse, and his emotional problems around the time of the murder. They also presented 2 doctors who had treated Payne, who testified about the effects of alcohol and medication on a person's reasoning abilities. Payne himself did not testify at the trial. The jury deliberated and found Payne guilty on all 3 counts of capital murder. After the guilty verdict, the trial moved to the sentencing phase. The same jury had to decide whether to recommend a sentence of death or life in prison without parole. During this phase, Payne's defense team presented more evidence about his difficult life. They called Payne's mother, his 2 sisters, and the 2 doctors again. The prosecution argued that the crime was brutal and that Payne deserved the death penalty. The jury voted 11-1 to recommend the death sentence. The trial judge then held a separate sentencing hearing. The judge considered all the evidence from both the trial and the sentencing phase. The judge also reviewed a pre-sentence investigation report. The judge found one aggravating circumstance, that the capital offense was committed while Payne was engaged in the commission of a robbery and kidnapping. The judge found one statutory mitigating circumstance, that Payne was 21 years old at the time of the offense. The judge also found 4 non-statutory mitigating circumstances, that Payne was under the influence of drugs and alcohol at the time of the offense, that Payne was undergoing emotional problems about the paternity of a child, that Payne had a bad childhood because of his stepfather's alcohol problems and abuse, and that Payne had a good relationship with his family. However, after weighing the aggravating circumstance against the mitigating circumstances, the judge concluded that the aggravating circumstance outweighed the mitigating circumstances. On June 13, 1994, the judge sentenced Max Landon Payne to death. Payne appealed his conviction and death sentence directly to the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals. His appeal raised several issues. He argued that the prosecutor had made improper comments during closing arguments that suggested he should testify. He argued that he was denied his right to a speedy trial because of the 25-month delay between his indictment and his trial. He argued that the trial judge should have given a different jury instruction on circumstantial evidence. He also argued that the police had illegally searched his car. The Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals rejected all of these arguments and affirmed his conviction and death sentence on November 2, 1995. Payne then appealed to the Alabama Supreme Court, which also affirmed his conviction and sentence on March 29, 1996. The United States Supreme Court refused to hear his case on April 14, 1997. After his direct appeals failed, Payne filed a petition for post-conviction relief under Alabama Rule of Criminal Procedure 32. In this petition, he raised new claims. He argued that his trial lawyers had been ineffective for failing to investigate and present more evidence about his mental health and his difficult background. He also argued that his appellate lawyers had been ineffective for failing to raise these claims on direct appeal. The trial court held an evidentiary hearing on these claims. The court heard testimony from one of his trial lawyers, from his sister Wilma, and from other witnesses. The court also reviewed affidavits from expert witnesses. The court ultimately rejected all of Payne's claims. The court found that his trial lawyers had conducted a reasonable investigation and had presented significant mitigation evidence. The court also found that his appellate lawyers were not ineffective. Payne appealed this decision, and the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed the denial of his petition on February 25, 2000. The Alabama Supreme Court declined to review the case again. Payne then filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in federal court. This is a legal action that allows a state prisoner to challenge his conviction in federal court based on violations of federal law. In his federal petition, Payne again argued that his lawyers had been ineffective for failing to investigate and present mental health evidence and more detailed background evidence. The federal district court rejected his claims. The district court found that Payne's ineffective trial counsel claims were procedurally barred because his appellate lawyers did not raise them on direct appeal as required by Alabama law. The court also found that, even on the merits, his lawyers were not ineffective. Payne appealed this decision to the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. The 11th Circuit reviewed his case and affirmed the district court's decision on August 18, 2008. The 11th Circuit found that Payne's trial lawyers had conducted a reasonable investigation. They noted that Payne's lawyers had obtained a mental evaluation, had hired an investigator, and had presented significant evidence about his difficult childhood, his alcohol abuse, and his emotional problems. The court concluded that Payne had not shown that his lawyer's performance was deficient, and he had not shown that any additional evidence would have changed the outcome of his case. After exhausting all of his appeals, Payne's execution date was set. On October 8, 2009, at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, Max Landon Payne was executed by lethal injection. He was 38 years old. He had been on death row for 15 years. Before the execution, Payne had a final meal, which consisted of a turkey sandwich with tomatoes and mayonnaise, potato salad, and cake. He also divided his personal possessions among his sister Wilma, a friend, and 2 other death row inmates. His final words were, "I just want to tell my family I love them." He made a hand sign that meant, "I love you," to his relatives in the witness viewing room. Then he was strapped to a gurney, and the lethal injection was administered. He was pronounced dead at 6:25 p.m. that evening. No relatives of Braxton Brown attended the execution. Max Landon Payne was pronounced dead at 6:25 p.m. on October 8, 2009, and the case of Braxton Brown was finally closed. Story 4. Mark Howard McLean was born on June 1, 1967, in the state of Georgia. He was a white male with red hair and blue eyes. He grew up in a family that included his father, William McLean, his sister, Sharon McLean Gay, and his brother, Tim McLean. His parents were not together for most of his childhood, and the family structure was not always stable. When Mark was still young, his mother passed away. Her death had a strong effect on him. After she died, Mark began to change. He started spending time with a group of friends that his family considered a bad influence. He stopped making good choices and began to drift away from the path his family had hoped he would follow. He started using drugs, and this became a pattern in his life that continued for many years. Mark did not complete a formal higher education. He went to school like other children, but he did not go to college. Instead, he found work in physical labor. At one point, he worked for a moving company. His job involved going into people's homes and packing their belongings. He was known by his co-workers and supervisors as a hard worker. One of his supervisors later said that Mark had an excellent work ethic and a pleasant personality. Some of his friends also saw him as a patient, kind, and caring person in his personal relationships. Despite having some good qualities, Mark had a troubled side that became more visible as he grew older. He began to get into trouble with the law when he was still a young man. He was convicted of crimes and sent to prison. He spent time behind bars for offenses that involved theft and violence. His criminal record grew over the years. He was convicted of armed robbery and other serious felonies. He was also convicted of possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. Each time he went to prison, he would eventually be released, but he kept returning to criminal behavior. Mark had relationships with women during his adult life. One of these relationships was with a woman named Tina Butler. They were together for some time before the events that would later change everything. Tina was an important person in his life, and they spent a lot of time together. Mark often stayed at her apartment. Their relationship was not always smooth, and they sometimes argued about money and other issues. After serving time in prison, Mark was released. He tried to live a cleaner life after his last release. He worked regularly at his moving job and tried to stay out of trouble. He made an effort to be a productive member of society, but the habits from his past were still there. He still used drugs from time to time, and he still had the mindset of someone who had spent years committing crimes. His friends and family noticed that he was trying, but they also saw that he was still struggling with his old behaviors. On the night before the events that would later define his life, Mark was with Tina Butler. They were at her apartment. They had been drinking and talking about their relationship. Tina told Mark that she needed money. Mark did not have a steady supply of cash, and this conversation made him feel pressure. He left her apartment around 1 o'clock in the morning. He got into his blue Buick car and drove away. He did not tell Tina where he was going. He simply left. At that moment, Mark was a 27-year-old man with a long criminal history, a troubled childhood marked by the loss of his mother, a pattern of drug use, and a life that had gone back and forth between prison and freedom. He had a job, a girlfriend, and a family that still cared about him. But he also had a past that kept pulling him back into trouble. He was driving through the night, and he had no clear plan for what he would do next. Mark McLean drove his blue Buick to the Domino's Pizza store on Washington Road in Augusta, Georgia. He parked his car beside the building. It was shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, November 20th, 1994. The store was closed for carry-out orders, but deliveries were still being made. A delivery man named Philip Weeks returned to the store from making his last deliveries. As Weeks walked toward the door, McLean approached him. McLean asked if he could buy a pizza. Weeks told him that the store was closed, and they were not selling carry-out pizzas at that hour. McLean would not accept this answer. He became insistent and refused to leave. Weeks tried to calm the situation. He told McLean that he would go inside and ask the manager if they could make an exception. Weeks began yelling to the manager from outside the store. The manager's name was Kevin Scott Brown. He was 28 years old. Kevin Brown weighed approximately 450 pounds. Because of his size, he could not move quickly. Kevin looked at Weeks through the door. He saw that Weeks had his hand on the door, so he released the security lock to let him in. As the door opened, McLean tried to push his way inside behind Weeks. Weeks tried to block him, but McLean pulled out a small revolver. When Weeks saw the gun, he ran through the store and escaped out the back door. Kevin Brown remained behind the counter. He could not run away because of his size. As Weeks was running out the back, he heard McLean order Kevin to give him the money. Weeks kept running. He ran to a service center on Washington Road to find a pay telephone and call the police. But the pay phone was broken. Weeks then started to run across the road to another phone at a gas station. As Weeks began to cross the road, he saw a blue car speed out of the Domino's parking lot. The car turned onto Washington Road. Weeks recognized the car as the one McLean had arrived in. McLean saw Weeks looking at him. As he drove past, McLean made an obscene gesture toward Weeks with his middle finger. Weeks ran into the road behind the car and memorized the license plate number. He then flagged down a passing driver. The driver took Weeks back to the Domino's store. When Weeks entered the store, he found Kevin Brown lying on the floor behind the counter. Kevin had been shot once in the chest. He was bleeding heavily and was barely alive. Weeks called 911 immediately. But before paramedics could arrive, Kevin Brown bled to death from his wound. The keys to the store's cash till, which Kevin normally kept in his pocket, were found in the till. Approximately $100 to $130 was missing from the store. McLean had taken the money from the till. Within 1 hour of leaving Tina Butler's apartment, McLean returned to her home. He gave Tina $100 in cash. He did not tell her where the money came from. He did not explain what he had done. He spent the rest of the night and most of the following day at Tina's house. During that time, he left his blue Buick parked at her house. He also left behind his army jacket, his boots, and the revolver he had used to shoot Kevin Brown. When McLean left Tina's home the next afternoon, he drove her car instead of his own. Meanwhile, the police had started their work. Philip Weeks had given them the license plate number he had memorized. The police traced that plate number to McLean's father, William McLean. The officers contacted William McLean and asked him about the car. William told the police that his son Mark was the primary driver of the blue Buick. He also gave the police a description of his son. That description matched the description that Philip Weeks had given of the man who forced his way into the Domino's store. The police also spoke to the assistant manager of that Domino's store. The assistant manager looked at a photo or description and identified Mark McLean as a customer who had bought a pizza from the store 2 days before the shooting. McLean had used the name Johnson when he placed that order. Later, police found the box with the receipt for that pizza in the trash during a search of McLean's residence. This linked McLean to the store before the crime. At this point, the police had a strong case. They had an eyewitness who saw McLean force his way into the store and demand money. They had a license plate that traced back to McLean's father. They had a description that matched McLean. They had evidence that McLean had been in the store just 2 days before. And they had a victim who was dead from a single gunshot wound. The police had not yet arrested McLean, but they knew who they were looking for. On the morning of Monday, November 21st, 1994, Mark McLean drove the blue Buick to his workplace. He arrived at his job as usual, but police officers were waiting for him there. They arrested him and took him into custody. McLean was now officially charged with the murder of Kevin Brown and the armed robbery of the Domino's Pizza store. That same evening, while McLean was in jail, he made a telephone call to Tina Butler. During this call, McLean instructed Tina to get rid of the clothes, boots, and gun that he had left at her house. He also demanded that Tina provide him with a false alibi for the night of the shooting. He told her to say that he had been with her during the time of the crime. He threatened to implicate Tina and her family in the crime if she refused to help him. Tina Butler was frightened by these threats. She decided to follow McLean's instructions at first. She hid his jacket in a neighbor's shed. She gave his gun to her nephew, Diego Davis. She did not report what had happened to the police immediately, but the police had already begun questioning her. They came to her home and asked her about the events of that night. Tina did not tell them everything on the first visit. She was still afraid of McLean. However, the police returned a second time. During this second interview, Tina became more cooperative. She told the police about McLean's telephone call from jail. She gave them McLean's jacket and boots. The gun was recovered about a month later. It was found when Tina's nephew was involved in another shooting incident. The police now had physical evidence linking McLean to the crime. McLean was formally indicted on November 29, 1994. The charges against him were malice murder, felony murder, armed robbery, possession of a firearm during a crime, and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. On January 4, 1995, he was re-indicted on the same charges, with an additional count of burglary added. The trial began in September 1995. The trial was held in Richmond County Superior Court. Judge J. Carlisle Overstreet presided over the case. The prosecution presented its evidence to the jury. Philip Weeks testified about what he had seen that night. He described how McLean forced his way into the store and demanded money from Kevin Brown. He told the jury about the blue car and the license plate he had memorized. Tina Butler testified against McLean. She explained how he had returned to her house with cash, how he had threatened her from jail, and how she had hidden his belongings. Police officers testified about tracing the car to McLean's father and about finding the evidence. The prosecution argued that McLean intentionally shot Kevin Brown during the robbery. They pointed out that McLean had been convicted of armed robbery before. They said he was an experienced criminal who chose to kill rather than leave without shooting. The prosecution also presented testimony about McLean's prior criminal record during the sentencing phase. They argued that he was a danger to society and deserved the death penalty. McLean's defense team presented their case. McLean himself took the witness stand. He admitted that he had intended to rob the store, but he claimed that the shooting was an accident. He testified that he heard a noise as he was leaving and believed Kevin Brown was coming after him. He said he turned around and the gun went off. He told the jury he did not know if Brown had been hit. The defense also tried to present mitigating evidence during the sentencing phase. They argued that McLean's childhood had been difficult, that he had lost his mother at a young age, and that he had struggled with drug addiction. They asked the jury to spare his life. On September 7, 1995, the jury found Mark McLean guilty of malice murder, felony murder, burglary, armed robbery, and possession of a firearm during a crime. He later pleaded guilty to the charge of possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. The jury then moved to the sentencing phase. They had to decide whether McLean would receive life in prison or the death penalty. The jury found 3 aggravating circumstances: that the murder was committed during a burglary, that it was committed during an armed robbery, and that it was committed for the purpose of receiving money. On September 8, 1995, the jury recommended the death penalty. The judge agreed and sentenced McLean to death. He also received additional sentences of 20 years for burglary, life in prison for armed robbery, and 5 years for each firearms charge. McLean began the appeals process immediately. His lawyers filed a direct appeal to the Georgia Supreme Court. They argued that the evidence was not sufficient, that the prosecutor made improper arguments, and that the death sentence was too harsh compared to other similar cases. On November 12, 1996, the Georgia Supreme Court upheld McLean's conviction and death sentence. McLean then appealed to the United States Supreme Court. That court denied his request to hear the case on June 23, 1997. McLean continued to fight his sentence through other legal means. He filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in state court on December 3, 1997. This was a legal action asking the court to review whether his imprisonment was lawful. An evidentiary hearing was held on July 15, 1999. On August 17, 2000, the state habeas corpus court denied his petition. McLean appealed this decision to the Georgia Supreme Court, but they denied his application on April 15, 2002. He then filed another petition with the United States Supreme Court, which was denied on November 18, 2002. McLean then filed a federal habeas corpus petition on October 31, 2002, in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Georgia. He argued that his trial lawyers had been ineffective. He said they should have investigated and presented more evidence about his troubled childhood, his drug addiction, and his good character. On June 26, 2007, the district court denied his petition. He appealed to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. The 11th Circuit heard oral arguments on September 30, 2008. On December 18, 2008, they issued a ruling denying him relief. McLean then filed one final petition with the United States Supreme Court. On October 5, 2009, the Supreme Court denied his request to hear the case. All of his appeals had been exhausted. On October 8, 2009, the Superior Court of Richmond County set a 7-day execution window. The execution could happen between noon on October 20th and noon on October 27th. The Georgia Department of Corrections then set the specific date and time. McLean would be executed at 7 p.m. on October 20th, 2009. McLean asked the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles for clemency, but they denied his request on October 16, 2009. On the day of his execution, McLean was offered a final meal. He declined. He was offered a sedative to calm his nerves 1 hour before the execution. He refused that too. At approximately 6:15 p.m., his lawyers informed him that the United States Supreme Court had denied his final motion for a stay of execution. He had no visitors on that day, but he did speak to 2 relatives by telephone. At 7 p.m., the execution began at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison in Jackson, Georgia. Prison warden Steve Upton asked McLean if he would like a prayer to be said for him. McLean replied, "No, I'm fine." He lay on the table with his eyes open. He did not make eye contact with the witnesses. 2 IVs were inserted into his arms. A series of deadly drugs entered his body. His complexion turned pale. His body lunged forward slightly as one of the drugs raced through his veins. The execution was quiet and proceeded on schedule. He was pronounced dead at 7:24 p.m. on October 20th, 2009. Kevin Brown's friends and family were left to grieve. Kevin was an only child. His mother had died when he was young. His father, Albert Brown, testified at the trial that his son's murder left him devastated and in a state of deep depression. He said Kevin was not only his son, but also his friend. Albert Brown has since passed away. Kevin's friends in the Augusta music community remembered him as a simple, kind man who loved playing bass guitar. They held an annual concert in his memory called Rocking the Stocking to benefit others. The case ended with Mark McLean's execution, but the loss of Kevin Brown stayed with those who knew and loved him for the rest of their lives. Story 5. Reginald Winthrop Blanton was born on June 3, 1981, in Alameda County, California. He came into the world with a twin brother named Robert. The 2 boys were identical twins, which meant they looked very much alike. Being a twin was a major part of Reginald's identity from the very beginning. He and Robert were born together, and they grew up together, sharing the same home and the same family experiences. Their mother had a difficult pregnancy with the 2 babies, and the problems started even before they were born. During the pregnancy, Reginald's mother was pushed down a flight of stairs. This was a violent and dangerous event. She fell down the stairs while she was carrying the twins inside her body. This fall put the babies at great risk and caused problems for their development in the womb. When the time came for the babies to be born, there were further complications. Reginald was born in a position called breech. This means he did not come out head first like most babies. Instead, his feet came out first. This is not the normal way for a baby to be born, and it can cause the baby to have trouble breathing. Because of the breech birth, Reginald swallowed fluid during the delivery. When he came out, his body was blue in color. This blue color meant that his body was not getting enough oxygen. The doctors who delivered him were very concerned. They gave him a test called the APGAR test, which measures how well a newborn baby is doing right after birth. The test uses a score from 0 to 10. A score of 10 is perfect health. Reginald scored a 1, which is the lowest possible score. This score meant he was in very poor condition and was struggling to survive. The doctors had to work quickly to help him breathe and get oxygen into his body. Fortunately, the doctors were able to help him recover. By the time he was 15 days old, his APGAR score had returned to a normal level, and he appeared to be healthy. But the difficult birth was a sign of the challenges that would follow him throughout his life. Reginald's home life was not peaceful or stable. His parents had a troubled relationship filled with conflict. His father was physically abusive. The father used violence against Reginald's mother, hitting her and hurting her in front of the children. Reginald and Robert watched their father assault their mother many times. This was a frightening and painful experience for both boys. They saw violence in their home on a daily basis. The father did not only hurt the mother, he also assaulted Reginald's older sister. So violence was a normal part of family life for Reginald. There was no safety or peace inside the house. The children lived in fear and witnessed things that children should never have to see. When Reginald was still a young boy, his parents decided to end their marriage. They went through a divorce. The divorce meant that the family was split apart. After the divorce, Reginald and his siblings had to deal with the separation of their parents. But the divorce did not bring peace. Instead, things became even more difficult for Reginald. His relationship with his mother suffered after the divorce. They did not get along well, and there was a lot of tension between them. His relationship with his father was even worse. Reginald felt a great deal of anger towards his father. He was angry about the abuse his father had caused to his mother and sister, and angry about the violence that had filled his childhood. This anger stayed with him for many years and affected how he behaved. At school, Reginald began to have problems very early on. He was intelligent, and people noticed that he was smart, but he had a lot of trouble sitting still in class. He could not focus on his lessons. His teachers noticed that he was restless and could not pay attention for long periods of time. They spoke to his mother about his behavior. His mother allowed the school to put him on a medication called Ritalin. Ritalin is a drug that is often given to children who have trouble sitting still and focusing. The medication was meant to help Reginald calm down and pay better attention in school. But even with the medication, his behavior problems continued. As Reginald got older, his troubles increased. He started using drugs at a very young age. By the time he was 11 years old, he was already smoking marijuana. This was a very early age to start using drugs. Marijuana is an illegal drug, and using it at such a young age affected his mind and his behavior. He also started using other substances, including inhalants. Inhalants are dangerous chemicals that people breathe in to get a high feeling. This kind of drug use can damage the brain and cause serious health problems. His drug use became a way for him to escape from his difficult life and the problems at home. He used drugs to numb his pain and to forget about the violence and sadness he had experienced. Reginald did not receive treatment for his drug addiction during his teenage years. Even when he got in trouble with the law and was sent to detention centers, his addiction was not properly addressed. He was not given the help he needed to stop using drugs, so he continued to use them. Without treatment, his addiction grew worse, and his behavior became more dangerous. Because his family did not provide him with safety or protection, Reginald looked for those things elsewhere. He joined gangs in San Antonio, Texas, where his family had moved. Gangs are groups of people who often commit crimes together and who provide a sense of belonging. Reginald joined a gang because he wanted protection from the violence in his neighborhood and because his family was not able to keep him safe. The gang became a substitute family for him. It gave him a sense of identity and security that he did not have at home. But being in a gang also meant that he was surrounded by crime and violence. He had to follow the rules of the gang, and he was expected to participate in illegal activities. Reginald's behavior continued to get worse as he went through his teenage years. He began to get into trouble with the law. His juvenile criminal record started to grow. When he was still a minor, he was arrested and convicted of several crimes. One of his early offenses was shoplifting. Shoplifting means stealing items from a store. He was caught stealing, and this was noted by the police. He was also given a warning for criminal trespassing, which means entering someone else's property without permission. These were minor offenses, but they were signs of a pattern of law-breaking. His crimes became more serious over time. He was convicted of burglary. Burglary means breaking into a building with the intent to commit a crime inside. This is a serious offense. He was also convicted of unlawfully carrying a weapon. This means he had a weapon, such as a gun or a knife, in his possession when he was not legally allowed to have it. He was convicted of auto theft, which means stealing a car. He was also convicted of possession of marijuana. Possession of marijuana means having the drug on his person or in his belongings, which is illegal. These convictions happened when he was still a juvenile or a very young adult. Each offense led to consequences, such as time in juvenile detention or boot camp. He spent time at a juvenile boot camp, which is a strict program meant to discipline young offenders. But the boot camp did not change his behavior. He continued to break the law after he left. By the time he reached the age of 18, Reginald had already lived through a lifetime of hardship. He had experienced violence at home, witnessed his mother being abused, survived a difficult birth, started using drugs at age 11, joined a gang, and accumulated a lengthy criminal record. He had little supervision from his parents and no stable guidance. He had anger towards his father and a strained relationship with his mother. He had not received treatment for his drug addiction. He had dropped out of school and only completed about 10 years of formal education. Despite these challenges, he did manage to earn his GED, which is a certificate that shows he completed high school level education after leaving school. He also made some attempts to improve his life. He thought about joining the military or going to college, but these plans never came to fruition. He was a young man with a troubled past, surrounded by bad influences, and he had not found a way to escape the cycle of violence and crime that had defined his childhood. He was living with his girlfriend at the time, and his twin brother Robert was still a close part of his life, as they continued to spend time together. Reginald's life had been full of pain and poor choices, and he was heading into adulthood with many unresolved problems and a deepening involvement in criminal activity. At the time of the events that would change his life forever, Reginald Blanton was 18 years old. He was living in San Antonio, Texas, with his girlfriend Alkesia Hoyle. His twin brother Robert was still a regular part of his life. Robert had a girlfriend named Latoya Mayberry. The three of them spent time together often. Reginald had known a young man named Carlos Garza for some time. Carlos was 20 years old and Hispanic. He lived in an apartment complex called the Stepping Stone Apartments in San Antonio. Carlos was married to a woman named Yvonne, but they were separated at the time. They had a young son together. Carlos was a friendly person who liked to wear gold jewelry. He often wore a gold chain with a religious pendant, a gold herringbone necklace, a gold nugget bracelet, and a lion's head ring with red ruby eyes and a diamond in its mouth. He also had a broken gold rope necklace that was held together with wire. These items were valuable to him. Reginald and Robert both knew that Carlos had money and jewelry. About 3 or 4 weeks before the crime, Reginald had gone to Carlos's apartment and banged loudly on the door. A neighbor named Patricia Romano lived across the hall. She came out and told Reginald that Carlos was not coming to the door. Reginald became angry and told her to shut up and go back inside. This showed that Reginald was already interested in Carlos and his apartment. Around the same time, Carlos had been showing off his money in front of Reginald and Robert. He pulled out cash and displayed it. Reginald had warned Carlos that if he kept pulling out money, someone would rob him. This warning was a sign that Reginald was thinking about stealing from Carlos. On the afternoon of April 9th, 2000, the three of them, Reginald, Robert, and Latoya Mayberry, decided to go to Carlos's apartment. Their plan was to steal drugs and money from him. They got into a car. The car belonged to Mayberry's grandmother. Robert drove the car. Reginald sat in the passenger seat, and Mayberry sat in the back. They drove to the Stepping Stone Apartments. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the sun was still out. When they arrived, they parked the car and walked up to the 3rd floor where Carlos's apartment was located. They knocked on the door of the apartment. No one answered right away. At this point, Robert told Mayberry to go back downstairs and wait in the car. He told her to go because it was hot outside, and also because he wanted her out of the way. Mayberry went back down to the car and sat in the back seat. She was waiting alone. Robert and Reginald stayed at the door. Reginald did not want to leave. He told Robert not to go. Robert was scared of Reginald, so he stayed with him. Then Reginald and Robert took action. They both kicked the door of Carlos's apartment with great force. The door was strong, but the frame was not. The wood around the lock splintered and broke. The deadbolt lock was sticking out. The door swung open. There were footprints left on the door from their shoes. One of the footprints was about 12 inches long. Later, when Reginald's foot was measured in court, it was 12 1/4 inches long, which matched the footprint. Once the door was open, they entered the apartment. The apartment was not empty. Carlos was inside. He had just gotten out of the shower. He heard the noise and came around the corner to see what was happening. When he saw Reginald and Robert inside his home, he was surprised and asked them what they were doing there. Reginald did not answer with words that explained anything. Instead, he told Carlos to break himself. This was a slang term that meant he was being robbed. It meant, "Give me all your stuff." Carlos refused to give up his belongings. He said no to the demand. At that moment, Reginald pulled out a silver handgun. The gun was a .380 caliber pistol. He pointed the gun at Carlos and fired a shot. The bullet hit Carlos in the head, specifically in the left front scalp area. Carlos fell down to the floor. He was injured, but he was not dead yet. Reginald did not stop. He fired a second shot. This second bullet hit Carlos in the cheek area. Carlos was now lying on the floor, badly wounded. He was unconscious, but still breathing. His breathing was irregular and made a gurgling sound. After the shooting, Reginald and Robert looked around the apartment for drugs. They wanted to steal any drugs they could find. They pulled all the cushions off the couch in the living room. They ransacked the place, turning things over and searching everywhere. Carlos had a lockbox in the apartment where he kept valuable items. Reginald found the lockbox and took the lock off it. He stole cash from the box, about $100. He also took Carlos's jewelry. He took the gold herringbone necklace, the gold rope necklace with the religious pendant, and a small blue box that held other items. He put the jewelry in his hands and left the apartment. Reginald and Robert ran down the stairs and got back into the car where Mayberry was waiting. Robert was running fast, and his eyes were wide. He looked scared. He got into the driver's seat and started the engine quickly. Reginald jumped into the car as Robert was pulling away. Reginald had the jewelry in his hands. Mayberry saw him holding a blue box and several necklaces. She also noticed that Reginald was wearing a gold lion's head ring with ruby eyes and a diamond in its mouth. She had never seen him wear this ring before. Reginald took the silver handgun out of his pocket and showed it to Mayberry. He told her it was a .380. He was proud of the gun. As they drove away, Reginald realized he had made a mistake. He said, "Fuck, I left a bullet in the house." He meant he had left a spent bullet casing or a bullet behind in the apartment. He also told Robert that he wanted to go back to the apartment to get his dope, meaning the drugs he had not found yet. Robert refused to drive back because he was too scared. Instead, Robert drove to a friend's apartment. They stayed there for about 20 minutes. After that time passed, Reginald insisted on going back to the Stepping Stone Apartments. Robert drove them back, but this time Robert and Mayberry stayed in the car while Reginald went inside alone. He went back up to Carlos's apartment. He went inside again. When he returned to the car, he was laughing. He told them, "That motherfucker's in there snoring." He meant that Carlos was still alive, but barely, and was making snoring sounds as he struggled to breathe. He also said, "I thought I was going to have to do that motherfucker again." He was joking about having to shoot Carlos a third time. He said that he had turned everything over in the apartment and that he had taken $100 in cash. Now Reginald wanted to get rid of the stolen jewelry. He told Robert to drive to a pawn shop. On the way there, Reginald asked Mayberry if she thought the rubies in the lion ring were real. He was already thinking about how much money he could get. They arrived at the Easy Pawn shop at about 5:50 or 6 p.m. This was about 20 minutes after the shooting had taken place. Robert and Mayberry stayed outside the car. Mayberry was pacing back and forth and appeared upset, while Robert tried to calm her down. Reginald went inside the pawn shop alone. Inside the shop, Reginald walked up to the counter. He was wearing the lion ring and a gold nugget bracelet. He handed over 2 gold necklaces, the gold herringbone chain and the broken gold rope necklace, and the religious pendant. The assistant manager of the pawn shop, Brian Collins, took the items. He gave Reginald $79 in cash for the jewelry. Reginald took the money and left the shop. The entire transaction was recorded on a video camera inside the pawn shop. That video would later be used as evidence. After leaving the pawn shop, Robert drove them to a town called Adkins, which is outside San Antonio. While they were driving, Reginald was in a good mood. He was laughing and bragging about what he had done. He told them, "I peeled that motherfucker's head back. You see how he just dropped in the corner." He described how he had kicked in the door and how Carlos had come out of the shower. He repeated his demand that Carlos break himself and how Carlos had said no. Then he described shooting Carlos and shooting him again when he fell. He was proud of his actions and did not show any sadness or remorse. Later that night, Robert and Mayberry saw a news report about a burglary and murder. Robert told Mayberry that the door was kicked in, that Carlos had come around the corner, and that Reginald had shot him. He also told her that Reginald had looked for drugs but could not find any, so he shot Carlos again. The victim, Carlos Garza, did not die immediately. After Reginald left the second time, the apartment door remained open. A neighbor across the hall, Patricia Romano, had seen the damaged door. She noticed the door frame was splintered and broken. She looked inside and saw that the stereo was blaring loudly and that the couch cushions had been thrown off. She called the apartment manager. The manager arrived about 15 minutes later. The manager went into the entryway of the apartment and saw Carlos's body lying on the floor. The manager saw that part of Carlos's leg was still moving. A neighbor who lived downstairs had heard a loud noise from above, like something had fallen or tipped over earlier in the evening. The police were called to the scene. Officer Richard Odoms arrived at Carlos's apartment. He saw that the door jamb was destroyed and the deadbolt was sticking out. He saw a footprint on the door. He went inside and found Carlos lying unconscious in the hallway. Carlos had a bullet wound to his forehead. The officer heard Carlos make a gurgling sound, like snoring. He saw 2 spent bullet casings on the floor, one near Carlos's feet and one near his head. Paramedics arrived at about 6:30 p.m. They saw that Carlos was bleeding from 2 gunshot wounds to his face. He was still breathing and had a pulse, but his breathing was irregular. The paramedics put him in the ambulance and drove to the hospital. On the way to the hospital, Carlos's pulse stopped. He died from his injuries. The medical examiner later determined that Carlos had suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The wound to his scalp was the fatal one. He was only 20 years old. He left behind a wife, a young son, a mother, and 3 sisters who would all suffer from his loss. The discovery of the crime began on the evening of April 9, 2000, when the neighbor across the hall, Patricia Romano, noticed the damaged door. She had seen Carlos Garza earlier that day, and when she saw the splintered door frame and heard the loud stereo, she became concerned. She called the apartment manager, who came to look. They both saw Carlos's body lying on the floor inside the apartment. The manager then told Romano to call the police. When the police officers arrived, they immediately saw the broken door and the destroyed door jamb. They entered the apartment and found Carlos Garza unconscious with a bullet wound to his forehead. They also saw 2 spent bullet casings on the floor. Paramedics arrived and took Carlos to the hospital, but he died on the way. The police now had a murder scene to investigate. They collected the bullet casings and the bullet from the apartment. They took photographs of the footprints on the door. They interviewed the neighbors, including Patricia Romano and Ernest Barol, who lived downstairs. They also interviewed Ralph Vidal and Joseph Anderson, who had been with Carlos earlier that day. The police began looking for suspects, but they did not have a clear lead at first. 2 days later, on April 11, 2000, the police received a break in the case. That day, police officers were called to the home of Reginald and Robert Blanton's father because of a disturbance. Robert Blanton and his girlfriend, LaToya Mayberry, were arguing loudly outside the house. When the officers arrived, Mayberry gave them a false name. But her brother was there and told the officers her real name. The officers checked her name and discovered that she had active warrants for minor offenses. They arrested her and put her in the back of the patrol car. While sitting in the car, Mayberry told the officers that she had information about a murder that had happened a few days earlier at the Stepping Stone Apartments. She said that Reginald and Robert Blanton were involved. The officers took her to the police station for a formal interview. At the station, Detective Raymond Roberts interviewed Mayberry. He read her rights to her, which meant he told her she did not have to speak and could have a lawyer. She said she understood her rights and wanted to talk because the murder was upsetting her. She gave a detailed statement about what had happened on April 9th. She described how the 3 of them went to Carlos's apartment, how she waited in the car, how she heard 2 loud booms that she knew were the door being kicked in, and then 2 more booms that she knew were gunshots. She told the detective that Reginald came back to the car with jewelry in his hands, that he had a silver gun, and that he later pawned the jewelry. She also described how Reginald laughed and bragged about shooting Carlos. She signed the statement in front of 2 witnesses. After Mayberry gave her statement, the detective called Robert Blanton and asked him to come to the station. Robert was reluctant at first, but after he saw photographs of Carlos's autopsy and spoke with Mayberry alone for a few minutes, he decided to give a statement. In his statement, Robert said that Reginald had kicked in the door, that he heard a gunshot and ran out, and that Reginald later pawned jewelry. He also said he found out Carlos was dead from the news that night. He signed the statement. These 2 statements gave the police the evidence they needed to charge Reginald. The police also followed the lead about the pawn shop. They went to the Easy Pawn Shop and spoke with the assistant manager, Brian Collins. He showed them the jewelry that Reginald had pawned on the night of the murder. The jewelry included the gold herringbone chain, the broken gold rope necklace, and the religious pendant. Collins also gave the police a copy of the video recording from the pawn shop's security camera. The video clearly showed Reginald inside the shop, handing over the jewelry and receiving cash. The police also went to Carlos's wife, Yvonne, and showed her the recovered jewelry. She identified it as belonging to Carlos. She also showed the police receipts from the jewelry stores where she had bought the items for Carlos. The receipts proved that the jewelry belonged to him. On April 13, 2000, the police went to the apartment where Reginald was living with his girlfriend, Alkesia Hoyle. They arrested him for capital murder. When they searched him in the apartment, they found him wearing the gold nugget bracelet and the lion's head ring with ruby eyes and a diamond in its mouth. These items had also belonged to Carlos. In addition, the police found 4 baggies of marijuana and a shotgun in the apartment. Reginald was taken to jail, and the capital murder charge was formally filed against him. While Reginald was in jail awaiting his trial, he continued to get into trouble. In May 2001, he assaulted another inmate at the Adult Detention Center. The inmate had testified in another person's capital murder trial, and Reginald attacked him for that reason. This incident would later be used against him during the punishment phase of his trial to show that he was a continuing threat to society. Reginald's trial began in August 2001 in Behar County, Texas. The jury was made up of 8 women and 4 men. The prosecutors presented a strong case against him. They showed the jury the pawn shop video that clearly identified Reginald selling Carlos's jewelry. They showed the jury the jewelry receipts that proved the items belonged to Carlos. They called LaToya Mayberry and Robert Blanton to testify. However, both of them changed their stories at trial. Mayberry said that her police statement was not true. She claimed that the police had threatened her with a capital murder charge if she did not sign the statement. She denied seeing Reginald with a gun. She also changed her testimony from day to day. On the first day, she said she saw a gun. On the second day, she said she did not. Robert also changed his story. He said that the parts about the murder in his statement were not true. He claimed he only signed the statement so that the police would let him and Mayberry go home. Despite these changes, the prosecutors used the statements themselves as evidence because they had been read to the jury without objection earlier in the trial. The prosecutors also called other witnesses, including the paramedics, the police officers, Carlos's wife, and the pawn shop employee, to build their case. The defense tried to argue that Reginald was innocent. They presented a witness named Ronald Marshall, who said that Carlos had given the religious pendant to Reginald as a gift. He showed a photograph of Reginald wearing the pendant from a few months before the murder. But the prosecutors pointed out that Carlos had been seen wearing the same pendant on the day of the murder, which meant he had not given it away permanently. The defense also tried to argue that the footprints on the door did not definitively match Reginald's shoes. But the physical evidence, combined with the pawn shop video and the witness statements, was overwhelming. After hearing all the evidence, the jury took 12 hours to reach a verdict. They found Reginald Blanton guilty of capital murder. The crime was defined as intentionally killing Carlos Garza during the course of committing a burglary or robbery. The guilty verdict was delivered on August 24, 2001. The trial then moved to the punishment phase. The jury had to decide whether Reginald should receive the death penalty or life in prison. The prosecutors presented evidence about Reginald's criminal history, including his juvenile convictions for burglary, auto theft, unlawful carrying of a weapon, shoplifting, and marijuana possession. They also told the jury about the assault he had committed in jail while awaiting trial. The defense tried to present mitigating evidence to show that Reginald had had a difficult life. They called a pastor who said Reginald was a God-fearing person. They called a mitigation specialist who talked about Reginald's difficult birth, his mother being pushed down the stairs, the abuse in his home, his early drug use, and his troubled childhood. His mother also testified about the violence in their home. But the prosecutors cross-examined these witnesses effectively. They pointed out that the defense had not provided strong medical evidence of brain damage. The jury was not convinced by the mitigating evidence. They found that Reginald would continue to be a threat to society in the future. They also found that there were not enough reasons to give him a life sentence instead of death. The jury returned a death sentence. The judge formally sentenced Reginald to death. After the trial, Reginald began the appeals process. His lawyers filed a direct appeal to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. They argued several points, including that the evidence was not sufficient, that the jury should have been given instructions on lesser crimes, and that the prosecutors had improperly removed African American jurors during jury selection. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed all the arguments and affirmed the conviction and death sentence on June 30, 2004. The court found that the evidence was strong and that the prosecutors had given valid reasons for their jury selections. Reginald's lawyers then filed a state habeas corpus petition. This is a legal request to have a court review whether his imprisonment and death sentence were lawful. The state habeas court held hearings and considered new evidence, including testimony from psychological experts who claimed Reginald might have organic brain damage. But the state court was not convinced. The judge who had presided over the original trial reviewed the new evidence and recommended that the habeas petition be denied. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals agreed and denied the petition on June 22, 2005. Next, Reginald's lawyers filed a federal habeas corpus petition in the United States District Court for the Western District of Texas. They argued that his trial lawyers had been ineffective for failing to investigate and present enough mitigating evidence about his background. They also argued that his appellate lawyer had been ineffective for not properly presenting a claim about racial discrimination in jury selection. The district court reviewed the case in detail and denied the petition on June 1, 2007. Reginald appealed that decision to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit upheld the district court's decision on September 19, 2008, finding that the state courts had reasonably applied the law and that Reginald had not shown that his lawyer's mistakes had affected the outcome of his trial. Reginald's lawyers then took the case to the United States Supreme Court. They filed a petition for a writ of certiorari, which is a request for the Supreme Court to hear the case. The Supreme Court reviewed the petition and denied it on May 18, 2009. This meant that all of his appeals had been exhausted. The only remaining option was a request for clemency, which is a pardon or mercy from the governor. Reginald filed a petition for clemency on October 8, 2009. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles reviewed the request and recommended against granting clemency. The governor did not intervene. On October 27, 2009, the day of the execution arrived. Reginald Blanton was 28 years old. He was taken to the death chamber at the Huntsville unit, the state prison in Huntsville, Texas. The execution was scheduled for after 6 p.m. His fiancée, Sandra Stafford, and his friends were in the viewing room. Members of Carlos Garza's family were also present, including his mother, his wife, and his 3 sisters. Reginald was strapped to the gurney. His final words were spoken. He said that Carlos was his friend and that he did not murder him. He declared that the execution was an injustice and that it would not bring Carlos back. He also complained about the lethal injection drugs, saying they were not even allowed to be used to put down dogs. He told his friends and fiancée that he loved them and urged them to continue to fight for his innocence. He said he would see them again. Then the lethal injection began. The drugs flowed into his body, and he was pronounced dead at 6:21 p.m. The execution had taken only 8 minutes. After the execution, Carlos Garza's family spoke to the media. His mother said she missed her son dearly and that she had waited for this day to arrive. She said the execution brought her closure. His wife said that they could finally move on with their lives. She acknowledged that the execution would not bring Carlos back, but it provided justice for her and for their son. Reginald's twin brother, Robert Blanton, was never charged with the murder of Carlos Garza. The prosecutors said there was not enough evidence to show that Robert had participated in the break-in or the shooting. However, Robert later went to prison for other crimes, including drug possession, evading arrest, and assault. He was serving a 2-year sentence at the same prison where Reginald was executed. Reginald's fiancée and friends continued to believe in his innocence after his death, but the legal system had concluded that he was guilty. The case was closed, and both families were left to live with the consequences of what had happened on that April afternoon in 2000. The story of Reginald Winthrop Blanton ended with his death by lethal injection on October 27, 2009, while Carlos Garza's family carried the memory of their lost son and husband for the rest of their lives.